Hi, this is Shawnee Maurice from Hihu, where we take a look back at landmark games from the past and see how they hold up to current industry trends and standards. Today we look at Condemned: Criminal Origins, a first-person psychological survival horror game, which seems to be the craze these days in early access games. But this game came out 11 years ago, so when compared to modern mechanics, level design and story, how does it hold up nearly 11 years on? To answer that question, I'm gonna have to say surprisingly well. The game time only clocks in around 7 to 8 hours, but like an enthralling book, I couldn't put it down. The game is just so damn enjoyable. I've previously reviewed Fear and Doom, and I'm a big fan of the horror genre. In my Fear review, I said that it doesn't really hold up well due to bland locations, boring game mechanics, and a shitty story. And the horror parts weren't that scary until the end. In my Doom review, I said that the atmosphere was perfect and the sound design was spot on. Funny thing about Condemned, it was developed by the same company and used the same in-game engine as Fear. Fear came out only a month before Condemned, but Condemned clearly is the better game of the two and still holds up as a solid title in the year 2016. And I'm going to go into why, but before we go into Fear versus Condemned, let's talk about the game itself. You play Agent Ethan Thomas, and the game starts off with you and other agents arriving at the scene of a murder. Your colleagues are murdered with your own weapon by the killer, and you are framed for their deaths. You are on the run from the cops, and whilst using your unrestricted lab access to hunt down and investigate the location of the man that framed you for your colleagues' deaths. You go from location to location, searching derelict buildings for clues and the whereabouts of your perp, fighting off mentally ill plague-ridden junkies in dull-lit rooms with pipes that you've grabbed fresh off the walls. You generally don't come across many guns, and when you do, some have very little ammo in them. I mean 2 rounds at most. The game really wants you to be aware of your surroundings and lets you know that most things that can be grabbed or broken off something can be turned into a weapon. This is a really nice feature, and you don't generally see it in video games today. I think we take weapons for granted in video games. As per many first-person shooters, you will kill someone with your gun, and your enemy will drop some floating ammo on the ground as well as their gun. In Condemned, the enemy might shoot at you, turn the corner, realize that their weapon has no ammo in it, and then all of a sudden they are using their pistol as a melee weapon to bash in your skull. And this really adds a sense of realism. Even when it's you without the ammo, you will quickly run behind something after emptying your gun, find a pipe on the wall, rip it off, and end the life of some poor junkie with a pole to the face. This really did add a sense of realism that I rarely find in video games in terms of weapon management. My only criticism with the game in terms of weapon management has to be the fact that you can only carry one weapon at a time, and yes, in theory this is fine, but I found myself finding pistols and having to put them down to use a fire axe, break down a door, and then I'd have to run all the way back to pick up the pistol. It just felt like it didn't make much sense when the protagonist is wearing this big jacket loaded with plenty of handheld forensic equipment. Even when he was holding an axe and wanted to break out a pistol, it would have been more realistic to drop the axe when pressing a button to draw out the pistol from a pocket. You would use your pistol, and whenever you wanted to use the axe again, the pistol goes in the pocket. But this is an incredibly minor issue, and I only really found myself backtracking a few times to pick up desired items. The combat itself is fairly primitive, but hey, what isn't when it comes to melee? Essentially, you have your attack and you have your block. There isn't much of an indication in terms of when to block, but eventually you'd learn your timings based on trial and error. And this is quite refreshing, as a lot of modern games let you know when an enemy is about to attack by something indicating above their head. And yes, that's based on difficulty settings, but regardless, it really did add another sense of realism to the game. It's still fairly primitive in terms of its execution, but that's not really that big of a deal. The main strong point of the game are the levels and their design. In my Fear review, I complained that there was very few locations, and they were not that interesting. In Condemned, you go from a derelict building to a train station, to a closed down department store, to a library, to a school, to an apple vineyard. And as you can tell, the variety is pretty broad. These locations all looked fairly different from each other, apart from all being abandoned. The fact that things in the environment could be used as weapons also lended to a variety that gave the sense that no location was the same. Ripping off poles from clothes racks in the department store to ripping off a door of a locker in a school and pulverizing a few heads. You would never see that melee weapon again in the next location. All the levels were really memorable too. My favorite was probably the library. The level reminded me of the Dunwich building in Fallout 3 and the ghouls leaping out of nowhere, but this was so much more terrifying. And I'm not a claustrophobic person, but the limited space between the bookshelves, but not knowing where the enemies were or when they were going to pounce really upped the suspense. Speaking of suspense, I haven't really spoken about how fucking horrifying this game can be. The first level is probably the scariest to hook you in, and you can tell they spend a lot more time constructing that level in terms of the sound design and atmosphere, but there's something about Condemned's atmosphere that is truly horrifying. I played a lot of the first half of the game at the edge of my seat, and the sound design is really well done. The suspense hinges on a few things, mainly being low lighting, silence, ambient music in the background, and the occasional rustling of something around an unknown corner. Cheap gimmicks isn't where Condemned plays off like Fear did. It's so much more real, and we're not talking about a ghost girl, we are talking about mentally deranged junkies hiding out in the darkness wanting to fucking kill you. Some of the scripted jump scares were also magical and not really predictable at all. I really admire them for what they did with it. From time to time, you would come across a crime scene in relation to the man that you were tracking down, and you would have to pull out your handheld forensic gear to investigate the scene. These were not puzzles, but more downtime from the constant tension that the game lended. It was a really nice change of pace, and I really enjoyed them. A puzzle aspect of the game would have been nice, but these served as minor cutscenes without the cutscenes. The overall story is pretty far-fetched, especially by the end of the game, and it's not confusing, it's just a bit convoluted in terms of what is actually happening and why. A lot of things don't really go explained, and yes, you could argue by collecting shards and birds you gain a bit more insight into what is actually happening around you, but if you have to tell the story by hidden collectibles, then that's a bit stupid, especially from a game design point of view. If the player didn't collect shards, then they would not have much of an idea of what is actually happening and why. The hidden objects were often hidden amongst usable objects in the game, so you'd often run straight by them. You might have a really good weapon and not want to ditch it, so you stop looking at the walls around you. A pipe might be next to a metal shard, and you already have acknowledged the fact that your weapon is better than that pipe, so you just completely ignore it. I missed a few shards in the first missions, and I can say I had to Google the associated story bits. The story is a bit silly, but that's fine. I was still having loads of fun hunting down the man that framed me, so whilst the story is a bit vague and doesn't explain things at times, it still makes sense, and the ride from A to B is a wild one. The game is really enjoyable, and I found myself thinking, why was Fear not this fun? The game is aged wonderfully and still holds up incredibly well, and whilst the graphics are a tad dated, if you can put that aside like I did and allow yourself to be fully immersed, you are going to have a fantastic time. The game clearly has been a few influences for a few other titles. I found a surprising similarity between Condemned and BioShock, which is one of my all-time favorite series. Using the taser to electrocute your enemies and then whack them felt so similar to BioShock, only to come out 2 years later and then do something very similar with the Electrobolt plasmid and wrench. Even the health bars and their aesthetic reminded me of BioShock, and it's really nice to see that they borrowed a few aspects from Condemned. However, between the two, BioShock is clearly the better game in terms of the world, the story, the characters, as well as its level design and gameplay. The game cost roughly $14 on Steam, and I bought it at full price. I can say it's really worth it. I buy a lot of my games when on sale. I was just feeling like playing something spooky, and I really wanted to play it, so I just said fuck it and I bought it, and I can honestly say it's worth it, and I'll have a lot of fun replaying it soon. So whilst it's pretty short, and for that I understand that you might want to add it to your wishlist and buy it when it is on sale, but if you want a fun, immersive horror game, go and buy this game right away. But if you haven't played BioShock, go and buy that first. This is Shawnee Maurice from Hihu. Thanks for watching.